Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Transformation in Europe review. Starting off with PowerPoint question number one. In what ways do the above depictions of Renaissance art exemplify the ideals of the Renaissance? And I think in looking at these various artistic depictions, you can first of all get a pretty good idea of kind of the philosophy of both individualism and humanism and make a good comparison between Renaissance art as well as medieval art. So just to begin with here, if you take a look at this depiction of medieval art on the one hand and Renaissance art on the other, a number of these comparisons start shining through. First of all, you can tell how much more creativity and emphasis was placed on the artistic skill that went into producing the Renaissance piece of art. That the artist was really trying to become a master of the subject, of the human form, trying to make it as realistic as possible. I also noticed how the artistic depiction of the medieval art is very much focused on a religious theme. Now, both this picture and the Renaissance picture are religious in nature. They're both of essentially Madonna and Child, Mary and Jesus. But without really knowing that, it'd be much easier to depict a religious scene in the medieval art than it would be in the Renaissance art. Also, notice the difference between kind of the communal nature on the Renaissance piece, where there's all these people gathered together. The emphasis is more on the themes involved rather than the individuals. It's almost hard to make out the facial depictions of anyone within the Renaissance scene. They all look very similar, whereas if you look at the individual nature of both Mary and the baby Jesus in the Renaissance painting, you can really depict, features of both of them, that they're very distinctly and uniquely drawn, really kind of showing and hinting at the larger sense of individualism of the age. Certainly, the humanist idea of recreating the ancient past and trying to make it relevant to what at that point in time was the present also very much shines through here in this depiction and scene of Venus, a essentially scene from Roman mythology, as well as a depiction here of David, which is a religious sculpture in general, but it's definitely being modeled after Greco-Roman statues. The artistic style that's trying to be replicated here is one that is very, very similar to the statues of antiquity. So it was this blending, essentially, of the contemporary Christian ideals of the age, but expressing it in very new and different ways, focused much more on the individual skill of the artist and the attempt to try to recapture the glories of the past. And you can see all of those represented very well here in these various artistic images. All right, so PowerPoint question number two. What problems could such a religious split cause in Europe, and were there any potential benefits to the Catholic Protestant split? The easiest problem that one can identify is the long history of violence that breaks out and occurs after this time period. Is really for hundreds of years from this time period going forward. There's continuing hostility, warfare, and persecution between Christians and Catholics throughout Europe. You can look at examples such as the 30 Years' War as being a long, drawn-out, bloody conflict between Catholics and Protestants. You can look at the heightening of the Inquisition during this time period, trying to attack people of those different sects, as also being linked to the essentially kind of religious questioning which was occurring and happening at this point in time, and the reaction against it. Certainly, from the Catholic Church's standpoint, that's where a lot of the negatives come in, because really, from this time period going forward, it was pretty much unquestioned that there was not going to be a unified Europe. The Catholic Church and certain kings and emperors throughout history had still this idea of trying to recreate the Roman Empire in some way, shape, or form, and have there be still some sort of central political or religious authority over all of Europe. The Catholic Church was the closest in achieving that, at least on the religious side. But after the Protestant split, that dream had essentially evaporated. And it's important to know that the Reformation was just as much a political revolution as it was a religious revolution. This fits into a much longer narrative of how kings, for quite some time at this point in time, had been trying to increase their own authority and their own power within their lands at the expense of the church. They continually wanted to try to claim more power and more rights under their own power, rather than having to share that with religion and ideology coming through a centralized Catholic Church. The Protestant split gave those people who wanted to rebel or question the power and authority of the Catholic Church the ability to do so. And that's one of the reasons why you do see, for example, on a little map here, places such as England, large portions of the Holy Roman Empire, Prussia, portions of France and Switzerland. Essentially, the leaders, the secular leaders in those areas, a lot of them turned not particularly early on, not necessarily for religious reasons, but for political reasons, that they really saw that they were going to be able to use this split as a way to benefit themselves politically. Of course, that can be seen as either a good thing or a bad thing, but really the end result was that Europe was going to remain a very much politically and ideologically fractured continent for the foreseeable future, starting in this time period. There's also a lot of positives that came along with this, or what people could argue to be positives. I mean, a lot of this really kind of depends on the view or the lens that you're looking through. Certainly, the increase in the accessibility of Christianity to a large number of people, I think a lot of individuals would argue would be a good thing. That there was this idea that people should get their knowledge about religion through the religious sources themselves, in this case through the Bible. The great increase in the printing press and the spread of Bibles in vernacular languages certainly opened up that idea of religion to an increasing number of people. But in a lot of ways, this was also opening up Pandora's box. Because if you look around at Christianity today, you don't simply have Catholics and Protestants. You don't simply have Catholics, Lutherans, and Calvinists. You have an increasingly large number of denominations, as even Lutherans begin splitting and fracturing, Calvinists begin splitting and fracturing, Anglicans and the Church of England begin splitting up and fracturing. And if you look at the world of Christianity today, that's why you have so many different sects and so many denominations. You have Anglicans, you have Baptists, you have Anabaptists, you have, for example, the Amish or the Mennonites. You have Universalists. You still have Lutherans. You know, dating back to the time, you certainly still have Catholics. But there's an increasingly large amount of denominations within our world, because once it becomes acceptable to read and interpret the Scripture and the Bible, and everyone has access to it, they take ownership of it to a large degree and begin interpreting it and thinking of it in very, very different ways, which ultimately leads to this increasingly fractured nature that you see within religion, as people can continuously reinterpret the Bible to make the points that they would like to make and create the societies that they would like to argue for, and that they would like to create around them. So really, the emphasis, I think, went much farther than anything that Martin Luther had originally kind of conceived of, as in questioning the authority and hierarchy of the Catholic Church. And like I said, in a lot of ways, it was kind of Pandora's box with much farther reaching ramifications than anyone could have really speculated on or noticed at the time. One last potential positive that came from this, and this more, I would say, stems from the conflicts surrounding the Catholic-Protestant split, was that it ultimately ends up leading to religious reform in a number of senses. And quite simply the fact that there was so much violence that was taking place at this point in time, that it led secular leaders and philosophers and so forth to really begin questioning the logic behind a close link between church and state, and realizing that if you're going to have a society with multiple religions operating in it, there has to be some separation between the secular state and religious institutions, because as soon as one religious institution takes over and can bind itself with the state, there's going to be this persecution, there's going to be these upheavals, there's going to be this violence. So if you look at the very first writings in the time period of the Enlightenment, which we're going to be talking about in a few weeks here, really questioning the place of religion within society and arguing that really religious toleration is the only way to try to avoid and alleviate these problems, it's directly kind of coming from not just the split, but the outlying political ramifications and religious ramifications that occurred during this time period. All right, so part question number 3. What are some of the advantages of absolute monarchy and what are its disadvantages? I guess anyone who has been looking recently at the gridlock within Washington and Congress would be pretty easy to point out some of the advantages that might come along with absolute monarchy. Simply that things can get done very, very quickly if the leader or the monarch is in a mind to do so. Not a lot of debate, oftentimes, and decisions are made relatively arbitrarily, which, of course, in certain cases might be good, but I think a lot of people would argue in the long term would be bad. But certainly, as you see in this time period, if you can have a strong ruler that can combine themselves with good and competent advisors, along with kind of a willing people or population, that that's where you see some of the advantages of absolute monarchy and why people like Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, Frederick the Great of Prussia, Elizabeth in England were able to take this kind of absolutism and build some very strong state structures out of it. However, if you take any one of those 3 pillars away, a strong ruler, because of course these rulers don't last forever, and quite typically at this time period it's simply passed down to a relative or a son. So as soon as you get a ruler who's not good in there, as soon as you get a ruler who's combined with advisors who might not be the most intelligent, or necessarily are there for their own gain, not necessarily for the benefit of the country, or a population that is no longer willing to simply be ruled and dominated over, the benefits quickly begin to fall apart, and you can see a lot of the weaknesses of the absolute monarch system. Of course, this is on top of the fact that the vast majority of the population are absolute monarchies. Monarchies have 0% say in politics, in decisions that are made at the state level, as well as the fact that there's pretty much no protection for individual rights under the absolutist monarch system. So as efficient as it can be, as good as it can potentially work in kind of the right circumstances, for the most part, I think most people would argue today it is a system that is much closer to despotism, and something that in fact hurts the majority of people involved in the system rather than benefits them. All right, going on to PowerPoint question number 4. What developments in Europe helped lead to these new scientific ideas and their spread? First of all, I'd like to go back to kind of that reintroduction of ancient knowledge, the focus on discovering ancient books and ancient treatises and ancient knowledge through the time period of the Renaissance. As this becomes very, very important as these kind of ideas of rationalism, philosophies from the Greco-Roman world are reintroduced to Europe. And really for the first time in quite a long time, the idea of having a sense of curiosity about the world around you became more permissible and more accepted. And ultimately, that curiosity, I think, really drove a lot of these early scientists to begin using more than just accepted knowledge of the day or accepted scripture in order to view the world around them. A really, really good example of this is the reintroduction of On the Nature of Things, which was a treatise by the Roman author Lucretius during the he was writing in about 30 BCE. It was reintroduced in the 1500s, but really had a very detailed knowledge of trying to articulation of the philosophy of Epicureanism. It viewed the world as being built and constructed on natural processes. It proposed an early idea of the atom, that everything is made up of these small particles, and the idea that the world can be observed and understood through observation. And it's ideas like that that were discovered, or first articulated, I should say, during the Greco-Roman period, that are reintroduced to Europe at this point in time that end up having a profound impact. But it wasn't only just knowledge coming from the Greeks and the Romans that ended up triggering and sparking the scientific revolution. There was also knowledge coming from other cultures, particularly from Arabic intellectuals, who at this point in time, at kind of the year 1500 or so, pretty much had the most advanced understanding of mathematics, one of the most advanced understandings of astronomy throughout the world. And even if you look at Copernicus, for example, and his early ideal of a heliocentric universe, he was essentially basing that on some recent discoveries and knowledge coming out of the Arabic world. It's not surprising that the depictions and drawings that he makes are almost identical to what you see occurring and happening within the Ottoman Empire at this point in time. So certainly that leads to this kind of reintroduction of knowledge either from the ancient world or from the Arabic world. Certainly changes the way that many people begin observing the world around them. Of course, what made this entirely possible, very similar to the Protestant Reformation, was the printing press and the idea that people could articulate these new ideas, spread these new ideas, and share these new ideas with people around them in a faster and more efficient way than they ever had been prior to this time period. So the fact that once more a technology introduced from China in the printing press ends up drastically altering and changing the trajectory of Europe and European science. So just like if you think about how much of European exploration was based upon the contact with the outside world, very similar is the development of European science. The last aspect I would say that really had an impact on this was the Protestant Reformation. As you saw in the document exercises today, there was still a relatively contentious relationship between these early scientists and the church. And the fact that the Catholic Church was so busy trying to combat Protestantism at this point in time really, I would say, also left the door open for people in the scientific community to begin expressing their ideas more openly without the church perhaps noticing as much or cracking down as much as they may have had there not been a competing ideology or several competing ideologies for them also to be actively pursuing and attempting to squelch, which left the door open for these European scientists to essentially kind of begin their trade. And you also could see that there was a lot of attempt very early on, for example, with Copernicus and Galileo, to reconcile their ideas and their observations with traditional religion. But as time goes on, and there is more multiple religions established within Europe, that tendency also seems to decline as more and more the ideas of rationalism and science begin to become essentially the order of the day. Not for everyone, and it's important to note that just like the Renaissance, that the scientific revolution was still essentially being confined to a relatively small percentage of the population, that it was essentially a elite group of people who had the money, could afford to become educated, could afford to get a hold of these books, which are still expensive at this point in time, could share this knowledge, and could just, quite frankly, have the time to sit down and philosophize, to make these observations. So it's still not trickling down to the vast majority of the population, but is still being contained to a relatively elite group of individuals who are making these discoveries, who are talking about these discoveries, who are being influenced by them. Very quickly, I'm going to hop back up here to question number 2. Is there something I just thought of that is another potential benefit? And I think no matter what religion you're talking about, whether it was one of those break-off Protestant religions or the reforms you see taking place within the Catholic Church, religions ultimately ended up trying to focus much more on their spiritual side rather than their political aspects after this time period. And you can certainly see it with the Catholic Church that there's a real reinvigoration of trying to make sure that they were fulfilling their religious roles within society and had not to actively work against the corruption, which prior to the Reformation had been fairly widespread within the Catholic Church. There's a big reaction against that, and the Catholic Church, along with its Protestant counterparts, ultimately ends up becoming much more sincere, I would say, in their religious convictions from this time period moving forward. So another potential negative or potential positive, once more depending on kind of the way you look at it, but I wanted to go back and just touch on that real briefly. All right, skipping down to question number 5. What impact do you think the new science was to have on Europe and the world? And it's really hard to undersell the impact that this was going to have. I mean, really, if you look at the modern world that we have today, so much of the science and technology that goes into influencing and impacting our everyday lives, it's hard to imagine any of that developing without this scientific revolution process. The scientific revolution, of course, eventually ends up leading to increases in technology, which leads eventually to the increase in industry, which essentially the Industrial Revolution is the only way that Europe is able to catch back up in world economics. And ultimately ends up kind of propelling them into the world leaders of production. But the only thing that made that possible was the technology and the science driving the Industrial Revolution, which really kind of spiraled forward and greatly impacts our world still today. Looking specifically at Europe, like I said, the scientific revolution is kind of the beginning of the ways, as well as exploration, for Europe to begin kind of playing catch up and trying to go from being, like I said, at the beginning of our class period, one of the sort of forgotten places in the world to becoming essentially the focal point of the world in a lot of cases moving forward. Um, and also what goes hand in hand with this, I would say, is that science is being entered into a Europe that is increasingly being divided by uh, these kings and these kingdoms, by religion, and that science becomes to play a part in that as well. If you want to think of the increasingly devastating nature of weapons and warfare that occurs from this time period going forward, um, that is very much influenced by the very combative nature that the science is developing in. And I think in that way, in that sense, you can even look at this as, in some cases, as a negative. That it's not just all positives. That because it's being developed in such kind of a hostile environment, that there's a lot of inventions that are creative that don't serve, the vast majority of humankind or the population. And that in some cases it can kind of be a cautionary tale as well. But still, if you look at the world we have around us today, it is very much based upon, in a lot of ways, these ideas of the new science. And just for the vast majority of people, I'm certainly not saying all people, but for the vast majority of people, the idea that looking at the world today is looking at a world based upon reason, based upon observation, based upon science. Now, of course, there are modern challenges to all of these notions. There are still people, for example, who would like to see religion taught in public schools. There are still people who are arguing that the world is flat. There are still people who are denying climate change. There's still people who don't think the moon landing happened. There's plenty of people who are very willing to throw out science in favor of other ideas. But that being said, I think there's still a general acceptance by most people within society that science is behind the world we have today, and in most cases, if there's a problem, most people look for a scientific solution to find the answer. All right, with that, we are going to be transferring over to our document exercise for this week. Um, Now, if you're thinking, a few reminders as we get going here. Looking at your grades for this week, I want everyone to be, just as a way of a reminder, to be making sure that when you're writing out your answers to these questions, that you are putting in specific examples from the documents themselves. A lot of people who lost points this week, you're losing points because you're not using specific examples. You can't just tell me, you have to show me. So if you say that the new science was a reaction against ideas of religion, you can't simply say that. You have to start picking out specific pieces from Copernicus, from Galileo, or from Francis Bacon that articulate this, that state this, and tell me why you are arguing what you are arguing. So if you got, for example, a 6 or a 7 on your points for your answers, the idea is probably that you had the right underlying conception of the answers themselves, but you weren't tying it together with enough specific examples from the readings. Now, I know, for example, this week's readings, that are relatively long, they're relatively dense, and I'm not expecting everyone to get all of the examples that I will be going through here. Uh, but even still, you have to at least make the attempt to show me that you've read these documents, that you understand them, and you can see how the content fits in with your wider answers and interpretations. So just a few reminders heading into the upcoming weeks here. That being said, let's go ahead and dive into our documents here. So question number 1, in what ways do these documents demonstrate the emerging principles of Western science? Now, a lot of the answers I highlighted for this you probably could have used as evidence or answers to question number 2 as well, because a lot of these ideas were also new and revolutionary as time went on. But I tried to focus with question number 1 specifically on these individuals' ideas and how they were a demonstration of kind of the wider principles of science. So, in Copernicus, very early on here, he states that not a few other eminent and scholarly men made the same request, urging that I should no longer, through fear, refuse to give out my work for common benefit of students of mathematics. I highlighted this as part of the influence of the principles of Western science because it shows how much Copernicus had written this document and was hesitant to publish it for fear of ramifications because of how radical it was, but that there was this scientific community and there were other, as he states here, scholarly men who were interested and had urged him to publish this. So it's important to note that people such as Copernicus and Galileo aren't simply writing for themselves, that they're writing for an emerging scientific community. All right, moving down here, for in the first place, they are so much in doubt concerning the motion of the sun and the moon that they cannot even demonstrate and prove by observation the constant length of a complete year. And in the second place, in determining the motions, both of these and the 5 other planets, they fail to employ consistently one set of principles and hypotheses, but use methods of proof based only upon the apparent revolutions and motions. For some employ constant or concentric circles only, others eccentric circles and ellipticals, and even by means they do not completely attain the desired end. Here he is essentially doing one of the first steps in the scientific method. He's looking at past research, past conclusions, and he's pointing out why he believes those are not correct. And essentially he's saying that all the other people who have done science and or have come up with ideas about the motion of the sun and the moon and the earth, he's arguing that they are very inconsistent in their findings, that their observations do not match one another, that there's no consistency, and therefore it leads him to believe that their hypothesis and their conclusions are flawed and in error. And that is why he feels comfortable eventually making his own observations, which he believes become much more standardized and can all be kind of one rule that is affecting all a motion of these heavenly bodies. Moving on then, he says, thus in the process of demonstration, which they term a method, they are found to have omitted something essential, or to have included something foreign and not pertaining to the matter in hand. This certainly would never have happened to them if they had followed fixed principles, for if the hypothesis they assumed were not false, all that resulted therefrom would be verified indubitably. So he's essentially accusing these people who had done work prior to this from making their conclusions first and trying to find evidence to fit the conclusion, arguing that that is kind of here the backward way to be doing things, that you need to start off with observation, with hypothesis, and have your results form your opinions. And it's very interesting that he is phrasing and kind of lecturing, in this case, the Pope on these kind of ideas of what we'd eventually come to think of as the scientific method, even here in the 1500s. Pretty astonishing to think that this is the way he's articulating his arguments in this very kind of forward-thinking kind of way. Moving on, he says, taking this as a starting point, then this idea that all past research has been wrong, this is why it gives him the ability and the confidence to publish his own works. He says that taking at this starting point, I begin to consider the mobility of the Earth. And although the idea seemed absurd, yet because I knew that the liberty had been granted to others before me to postulate all sorts of little circles for explaining the phenomena of the stars, I thought I also might easily be permitted to try whether by postulating some motion of the earth, more reliably conclusions could be reached regarding the revolution of the heavenly bodies than those of my predecessors. So really he's saying, because the past research has not been based exclusively on observation and their hypotheses have not been proved correct, that gives him the liberty to rethink and recalculate his ideas. And even though he says his conclusions may seem absurd, that's where his observations are leading him, and that's why he thinks that he is justified in this case in arguing for his points. Finally, he says, therefore, in the course of the work I have followed this plan. I described in the first book all positions of the orbits together with their movements, which I ascribed to the Earth, in order that this book might contain, as it were, the general scheme of the universe. And once more, another great example here of the standard of what they're trying to accomplish with the rise of Western science. They're trying to find these universal laws, these universal themes. Uh, and really, he thinks that that is what is going to prove his theories correct, because he takes note that all these other hypotheses prior to his time period were all flawed, that they were all in error, that they did not follow these universal themes because they're all different. And that's what leads him to say that he is going to attempt to use his observations of the stars, of the heavens, including the Earth in that mold, in order to try to come up with a much more salient theme of the universe. And of course, eventually the idea that he comes up with is that the sun, not the Earth, is the center of the universe, and that the Earth is rotating and spinning just like all the other planets around the sun. He didn't get this, of course, completely right. Copernicus didn't in his observations. He did not take into the account the elliptical orbits and so forth. But he was very, very close. And the first idea of making the Earth appear not as kind of the center of the universe is really articulated by Copernicus here. Even though, as I stated earlier, it's entirely possible that some of his ideas could have been influenced by other people around the world and the observations that they were making at this point in time. He becomes the first to really argue this theory and this hypothesis within Europe. All right, moving on to Galileo and how his words here are kind of representative of the rise of Western science. Skip down here to the third paragraph, where he says, men who were well grounded in astronomical and physical science were persuaded as soon as they received my first message. So he's really articulating here the ideas of the observations that he made with his telescope, of sunspots, the shape of the moon, of the observations of the various planets. And saying that those who are well grounded in physical science and astronomy were persuaded very early on by his message. He then goes on to say there were others who denied them, meaning his observations, or remained in doubt only because of the novel and unexpected character, and because they had not yet the opportunity to see for themselves. So he's really saying here that through observation, as soon as anyone else observes the same things that he had observed, they're going to become a believer. They're going to come to his side. And he's saying that the people who are well grounded or have made these observations agree with Galileo. Those people who are not are the ones doubting him. All right, moving on to Francis Bacon. There's certainly more to get to with Galileo, but a lot of that's going to be coming in the second phase here as to what was new or revolutionary about these ideals. Like I said, you could argue both ways for a lot of these, but I'll be getting them in one way or another as we go through. Certainly, Francis Bacon is writing in the 1620s, writing later than either Galileo or Copernicus. And you can really see he's articulating a more advanced form of the ideology behind this Western science. His first argument here, number 2, he states, the unassisted hand and the understanding left to itself possesses but little power. Effects are produced by the means of instruments and helps, which the understanding requires no less than the hand. Pretty much arguing here that human sensory experience in itself oftentimes is not enough to make the discoveries of the universe, that you need a telescope, you need a microscope, you need other tools to help your observation and to help your sensory skills in order to better perceive the world and the universe. Following that, number 3 says, knowledge and human power are synonymous, since the ignorance of cause frustrates the effect. For nature is only subdued by submission, and that which is contemplative philosophy corresponds with the cause, and practical science becomes the rule. So talking about kind of this process of knowledge becoming power, and how much these observations ultimately end up leading to the development of scientific rules, and how really, and he articulates this later on as well, that it's a long and drawn out process of developing rules, of testing those rules, and kind of developing this knowledge around these, what he would have considered kind of natural laws that people such as Isaac Newton were developing with the real, theory of gravity, or observation of the color spectrum, breaking light down into its components. And the development of rules based upon those observations should be kind of the basis of practical science. All right, so those will give you a good idea on where each of these authors kind of stand as far as how they're demonstrating some of these principles of Western science. So what was new or revolutionary about these ideas and principles? A lot of people did a good job here picking out how it was, in a lot of cases, a difference in ideology between the very kind of religious-centered nature of Europe at this point in time and uh, the observations that were being made by these individuals. And to a certain degree, just like question number 1 and 2, you can find a lot of similarities there. I think you can find a lot of similarities between questions 2 and 3. So it's not that these passages I'm going to be reading strictly belong to one of these or the other. A lot of them could be used for both, but do kind of show some of the underlying principles. First of all, within Copernicus, he says early on that it occurred to me to venture contrary to the accepted view of mathematics and well nigh contrary to common sense to form a conception of any terrestrial motion whatsoever. And really, I think this is, showing a revolutionary aspect of science where he's not simply relying on common sense, right? He's not simply saying that, well, everyone kind of knows this. It's the accepted mathematical principles of the day, so I'm just going to go along with that. It's the idea of questioning is so central. I talked about the influence and the impact of curiosity. Curiosity and questioning during this time period kind of go hand in hand, as people are starting to do that with the physical and material world around them to a degree that had not been done for centuries, at least within Europe. And that's why I think this is so kind of representative of what was revolutionary about it. The not simply taking things at face value, not taking common sense or scripture, but trying to base everything off of observation and calculations of the material physical world. Down below here he also says, and so after postulating movements which farther on in the book I ascribe to the earth, I have found by many and long observations that if the movements of other planets are assumed for the circular motion of the earth and are substituted for the revolution of each star, not only do their phenomena follow logically therefrom. And this kind of gets back to that principle I was talking about earlier, that he's looking for these underlying rules that govern not just the earth, but the planets and the stars as well. This idea that, kind of getting back to that Epicurean idea that I was talking about earlier, that the world and the universe are all constructed of the same materials and should all behave in the same way. And if you can find a rule for one, you can find a rule for the others. And that's really where Copernicus is making kind of the crux of his argument here. All right, going down to Galileo. Very early on here, the first paragraph, he says, some years ago, as your Serene Highness well knows, I discovered in the heavens many things that had not been seen before our age, particularly here through the use of his telescope. The novelty of these things, as well as some consequences which followed from them, in contradiction to the physical notions commonly held among academic philosophers, stirred up against me no small number of professors, and if I had placed these things in the sky, or as if I had placed these things in the sky with my own hands in order to upset nature and overturn the sciences. They seem to forget that the increase of known truth stimulates the investigation, establishment, and growth of the arts, not their diminution or destruction. Essentially saying here that there was this reaction to his observations and that people were acting like, he's just making this up, or that he created, the universe the way it is just so he could observe it. And he's saying, no, that's not the case. All I'm doing is reporting what I have observed, what I have seen, knowing these truths that stimulates, investigates, and establish the growth of the arts. And he's saying that that should be the goal of this new science, not to diminish or destroy investigation and the growth of truth. That's really kind of what his opening kind of powerful statement here is here to the Duchess. He goes on to say, showing a far greater fondness for their own opinions, once more here the people who are questioning his discoveries, than for truth that they sought to deny and disprove the new things which, if they had cared to look for themselves, their own senses would have demonstrated to them. And here Galileo is really articulating once again that if these skeptics of his could see what he has seen, could experience what he has experienced, that they would no longer be doubting him. And the only reason they're doubting him is because they have not had these same observations that he has had. Moving on down here, and this is really where you're starting to see another revolutionary piece of this that a lot of people touched upon in their answers, but this would be a really good way to tie it in. It is necessary for the Bible, in order to be accommodated to the understanding of every man, to speak many things which appear to differ from the absolute truth so far as the bare meaning of the words is concerned, saying that it's very hard to get one direct literal translation or truth of the Bible. But he goes on to say, but the nature on the other hand, the physical world, what he's talking about here, is inexorable and immutable. She never transgresses the laws imposed upon her, or cares a whit whether she abstruse reasons and methods of observation are understandable to men. Saying kind of nature doesn't care if you believe it or not, it's still going to be functioning according to these rules and these laws. For that reason, it appears that nothing physical which sense experience sets before our eyes, or which necessary demonstrations prove to us, ought to be called into question, much less condemned, upon the testimony of biblical passages which may have some different meaning beneath their words. So essentially he's saying the Bible is open to interpretation, nature in the physical world is not, which is of course a very radical theme and a very radical departure from tradition at this point in time. And I think it's important to note, and like I was talking about in the PowerPoint questions about how the Protestant Reformation impacted and influenced the scientific revolution, you really see it in this passage from Galileo, as he's essentially arguing that, there's the Protestant Revolution, people are reading and interpreting the Bible, they have different meanings, which means that it can't be kind of an infallible truth if there's so many different ways to view it. And you can really see the presence of the Protestant revolution coming through here, where it would have been much more difficult, I think, for Galileo to make this argument even 100 years before, when there only was one Catholic Church, the Bible was only in Latin, and only priests were essentially allowed to kind of administer religious services. Much more difficult to make that argument in that case, where, as opposed to this time period of the Reformation, when the Bible is being interpreted so many different ways by so many different people. And comparing that, to the other hand, to the fact that the nature and these laws which he is seeing, as he says here, right, she never transgresses, that it's a standard, it's a constant, and it is not nearly as open to interpretation as religious ideology is. So very, very revolutionary statement that Galileo is making here. Like I said, very much fits into question number 3 here, but I think overall is very important. All right, moving on to Francis Bacon. I think the third passage down here really articulates kind of this changing view too. He says, there are and can exist but two ways of investigating and discovering truth. One hurries on rapidly from the senses and particulars to the most general axioms, and from them as principles and their supposed indisputable truth derives and discovers the intermediate axioms. This is the way now in use. The other constructs its axioms from the senses and particulars by ascending continually and gradually till it finally arrives at the most general axioms, which is true but unattempted, the true but unattempted way. Essentially what Galileo is saying here is that there needs to be a long, drawn-out, and meticulous process for the discovery of these natural laws and these rules. That you can't just, as he say, hurriedly or rapidly use your sensory perceptions only to create these axioms. You need to take, the work that had been done before you, very meticulously record your evidence. Using assistance, as he states early on, from other instruments or items to help you make these conclusions. and to slowly and carefully build up an accumulated knowledge, which he says then finally arrives at the general axioms. By general axioms, I think he's kind of meaning these universal laws or these rules, as he mentions in question number 3, natural laws, as we might come to think of them. That's really what he's arguing for. You can't just kind of willy-nilly or hurriedly create these; that they have to be tied in with a much longer process. That process he really articulates very well in line number 100 here, the last one I have presented, where he says, we must not only search for and produce a great number of experiments, but also introduce a completely different method, order, and progress for continuing and promoting experience. For vague and arbitrary experience, as we have observed, is mere groping in the dark and rather astonishes than instructs. And this is really, he goes on to articulate essentially the scientific method. And he's arguing that this should be this new order, this new method of continuing to promote experience through science or through experimentation, through the scientific method of developing a hypothesis, doing your background research, then developing the hypothesis, finding an experiment to test that hypothesis, testing the hypothesis, then seeing if you can repeat that experiment to get the same result, and at that point either publishing your results so that other people can attempt the same experiment to get a similar result, or if you do not come up with the result you had expected in your hypothesis, you have to go back and form a new hypothesis and begin testing that. And only through this very slow, very meticulous process that he's articulating here can you eventually come to discover and to know these laws of the physical world. Much more so than if you just do something. For example, you go in for a vague idea, you set up an experience or an experiment, you're kind of surprised by the results, but then you just go and publish those and base your entire understanding off of that rather than trying to repeat the experiment, look at the variabilities that might be impacting your results and so forth, that you're going to getting a much more unreliable result. So all those are very good examples in here of how these authors really showed how their ideas and their principles were new and revolutionary to this time period. All right, question number 3. What role does religion play in these documents, and how do the authors attempt to reconcile their ideas with traditional religious doctrine? And I think really you can see both Copernicus writing to the Pope and in Galileo's writing that they are trying to come to some sort of consensus, or at least explain themselves to people who are questioning them on a religious basis. For Copernicus here, he says, I know that the meditations of a philosopher are far removed from the judgment of the laity, essentially from the judgment of religion or the church, because his endeavor is to seek out the truth in all things, so far as this is permitted by God and to the human reason. I still believe one must avoid theories altogether foreign to orthodoxy. So essentially what he's saying here is that there's not really a conflict between, or there shouldn't be a conflict between the mediations of a philosopher in the endeavor to seek out the truth in all things, particularly when it does not go contrary to or completely foreign to orthodoxy. So he's saying that his results here, even though they may appear to be very much different, he's arguing that they are only being created by him because essentially God had allowed him to use his human reason to discover those, and that his discoveries are not altogether foreign to orthodoxy, or he's arguing that they do not go contrary necessarily to the church teachings. And it's interesting how in the kind of the first paragraph to the Pope he makes that statement very much expressed here. Almost kind of an apology saying, God gave me this reason, I'm just using it. And I don't think that there is as big of a gap here as you might think. All right, Galileo certainly gets very deep into this in his letter to the Grand Duchess Christina. We already kind of touched upon this in his example down here with the fallibility of the Bible and the observations of nature. Another place where he states that is a little bit early in the document, where he says, with regard to this argument Essentially, that being that the Bible cannot err. He says, in regard to this argument, I think in the first place that it is very pious to say and prudent to affirm that the Holy Bible can never speak untruth whenever its true meaning is understood. He certainly qualifies that statement he just made, that the Bible can never speak an untruth, but he says it can only speak an untruth whenever its true meaning is understood. But he goes on to say then that, but I believe nobody will deny that it is often very obtruse, meaning it's very hard for people to get those understood meanings, and may say things which are quite different from what its bare words signify. So once more, this is going back to this idea that the Bible is very much open to interpretation, and that 10 people might read the same passage from the Bible, and they might all understand it in a different way. And that is one of the reasons why he goes on to argue that simply looking at science as being in contrary to the Bible is not enough to criticize it, because the Bible itself is very much being debated and different people have different understandings of its true meaning. He goes on to say then that this being granted, I think that in discussions of physical problems we ought to begin not from the authority of scriptural passage, but from sense experiences and necessary demonstrations. For the Holy Bible and the phenomena of nature proceed alike from the divine word, the former as the dictate of the Holy Ghost, and the latter as the observant executrix of God's commands. Once more, this is really an attempt to go and get that highlighted in there as well. This is really a way to try to kind of reconcile this idea. He's saying it's not, his observations essentially are just a different form of God's power, that God essentially created this natural world and he is only viewing it and demonstrating it, and that doesn't go contrary to what he would say as God's commands, right? The physical world, even if it might go contrary to the divine word or the Holy Bible. And this is not, Galileo certainly is not the last person to try to reconcile the ideas of religion and science. And we're going to start looking and talking more about this when we talk about the Enlightenment time period. How eventually ideas like this idea that because there was this increase in understanding of the natural world and a questioning of certainly the Bible and Scripture, that many people come to that same conclusion, that there has to be, if they still want to believe in a higher power, if they still want to believe in God, they end up kind of believing that God created this natural world, set these laws up for people to discover, and that simply discovering and recording and articulating these natural laws is not in and of itself an affront to religion, and is not in itself an affront to religious orthodoxy. Now, certainly, there are plenty of people within the religion who would argue and say that it certainly is, but Galileo expresses this idea. We're going to see it expressed in the future with people such as Rene Descartes. And certainly when we start talking about the idea of deists and deism, they are once again going to be articulating the same idea, that they're not completely willing to give up the idea of a God or of a higher power, but they're going to be reserving that God or that higher power in a space that still allows them to make their observations, make their scientific discoveries, and progress their understanding of the physical universe. And we're going to, like I said, see that really articulated and expressed again. All right, and finally, in Francis Bacon's example here, all I did was kind of highlight his name because I think it serves to show you how entrenched scientific revolution had become by the 1600s. Whereas Copernicus and Galileo seem to make great strides as far as explaining their discoveries, in some cases it almost seems like they're apologizing for the work that they're doing. Bacon doesn't waste any time with that. He doesn't express a regret that there's a difference between science and religion. He just doesn't mention religion at all and just gets on to the scientific part and the scientific nature of it. Because by that point in time, he realized that there was not going to be a questioning by the church of his writings or his ideas, and that he was particularly writing for other people who had already accepted Western science to be essentially truth, and that was the audience that he was writing for, as opposed to those earlier writers Copernicus and Galileo, who were writing to a much more skeptical audience, and just kind of shows the transition that was being made. And to a certain degree, that leads into answering question number 4, too. How do you think these documents fit into the emerging movement of Western science, and what impacts may they have had? Certainly, Copernicus and Galileo were very early on in this process. You could see, though, that even then they were writing to a very interested audience who was accepting their questioning of traditional philosophy, traditional science, and traditional religion. And by the time of Francis Bacon, you can really see that that questioning has been enshrined almost as the norm. And Bacon's main concerns are not so much arguing why science should be accepted, why it is correct or right, or explaining or justifying it. Bacon's main emphasis is how should science be conducted? What's the best or the most proper way to be doing it? Pretty much taking for granted that that is kind of the new law of the land to a certain degree. Now, that's not saying that the churches had gone away. It's not saying that the vast majority of the population even would have agreed with Francis Bacon and his ideas. Like I said, this was still being reserved for a relatively small amount or small percentage of the population. But for that group in particular, that these ideas were pretty much becoming, and increasingly so, the mainstream within the European intellectual communities. All right, that is where we're going to leave off for this week. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, I hope you have a great week.